This is Decentralized Radio. I'm Tristan.
And I'm Ryan.
The goal of this podcast is to help educate you on how to live your most optimal life. We will host industry expert guests to shed light on topics that matter.
We are not gurus, rather two individuals who have had to pave their own path to health and vitality, independent of the centralized systems that plague modern society. Today's guest is Maikel the Lion, and he is an agricultural student at the top-ranked university in the Netherlands. He specializes in bringing heat recovery and load balancing services for greenhouses and immersion-cooled Bitcoin mining. What does all of this mean? It means you can do some really cool things with agriculture and Bitcoin. So let's dive in.
All right, everyone. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Decentralized Radio. Today, we have Maikel on the line from the Netherlands, which is exciting. Maikel, how's it going?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. And of course, we have our lovely co-host as well, Ryan. Ryan, how are you doing today?
Man, I'm just a peach today. I'm feeling wonderful. I'm glowing. It's that time of year. The sun is out. I'm excited.
Oh, yeah. The sun has been shining pretty heavily here in the Rocky Mountains. So, Maikel, we connected on Twitter. You know, it seems like we have a lot of similar interests. You're into the agricultural horticulture system in the Netherlands, also into Bitcoin, and have a pretty, interesting journey, it seems, on diet as well, from vegan to carnivore. So I'm curious, why don't we dive in just a little bit about who you are and kind of your backstory to give the listeners, some background on why you're passionate about these things. So how did you kind of get into being interested and passionate about both agriculture, horticulture, and then Bitcoin, as well as, then we can dive into, some of the diet learnings you've had over the years.
Yeah, for sure. So when I was 19, I quit my studies in food technology, and which is also kind of my background, passion for food and food nutrition. But I didn't like to be in the lab, so I took another course on education, and I ended up in financial economics, which was much easier to do, and I completed it. But as the years went on in finance, I got this, they present you with really large models, and they are so abstract and far from reality. I was like, if I continue in this, it's only going to get more abstract and more ripped apart from reality. So this was during COVID, and so I needed to switch up, and I wanted to do something more practical. And my dad has always been a potato seller. Basically, he imports and exports. And then I landed on doing a master's in agriculture. And so the advantage of this was also in my mind, like, people always need food. So agriculture will always be relevant, even during a pandemic. It's an essential job. So I really like that. And then the start of 2021, I got into Bitcoin, or into cryptocurrency, I must say. And after that, like a year later, I got into my internship at Green Tech, and that is where the whole horticulture and Bitcoin, joined together, as we use these Bitcoin miners in horticulture, in greenhouses, to heat these greenhouses. And now we're in the current year.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, it's cool that you kind of had these passions. You left them. Maybe you pursued something in economics, and then you kind of went back to this later on in life, which I think is an important track. I've kind of almost had a similar path. It's a daunting decision for a lot of folks going into university, deciding on what they want to do. But I think there's so many options to have later down the line, and if you don't corner yourself into something, you actually have more flexibility than what you may think as you enter university. I think a lot of people overlook that. It's not necessarily that you have to do this for the rest of your life, but it can give you a good foundation. And you don't have to be in just one industry. And I think that's what we're seeing more of now is kind of a lot of overlapping industries, and the same mindset that you can apply to create a bit of disruption in a lot of these industries, which it seems like is exactly what you're doing, which is really fascinating. So what exactly is horticulture? I guess, can you give us like a brief explanation of that, and how are you exactly marrying that with the idea of Bitcoin mining?
Yeah. So horticulture is basically the art of mastering the climate in a house. So a greenhouse is typically made from glass. It is isolated from all outside influences. And so the things you control inside are the temperature, all the moisture, and even the CO2 levels inside the greenhouse. And by doing this, you can get up to 20 times more yield per size of land, per acre, or whatever. So in the Netherlands, specifically, our greenhouse sector is also a large energy sector. They provide around 10% of all the electricity in the Netherlands, and they do this by utilizing a CHP, or a combined heat and power unit, which is basically a gas turbine where the electricity is used for lighting, and excess electricity is sold to the grid. Secondly, it's a combined heat and power unit. So the heat is imported into the greenhouse, which causes a good temperature for the plants and nice consistent. And the other thing is the CO2 that is emitted from the CHP is also injected into the greenhouse. Greenhouse has around 3 to 4 times higher CO2 levels than outside, which is nice for the plants. And Bitcoin mining comes into play because a greenhouse requires heat, but the profit from this CHP comes from selling to the grid. However, the grid prices fluctuate very much because we in the Netherlands we also have a very high share of solar and wind. So sometimes these prices are negative, and the CHP is not financially efficient. So Bitcoin mining presents an additional energy asset, basically a global market for your electricity. And we also export the heat from these miners through immersion cooling techniques into the greenhouse. And yeah, that's basically it.
That's pretty interesting. I mean, I'm kind of newer to learning about this sort of stuff, so I'm kind of a novice when it comes to it. But I'd like you try to explain, because especially for me, because I'm sort of just kind of taking all this in, sort of explain me maybe the importance of doing these things and like applying more electricity and sort of widening that market out compared to like the traditional systems we already have in place for that, and sort of like where it can go in the future. Because I think a lot of people, like if I were to talk about this with my dad, he just simply would like go straight over his head. So I'd love to sort of know, like, why is it important to be doing things like this? And also, like, where can it go in the future? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So from a business side perspective, for the greenhouse operator, he is by implementing Bitcoin mining, he's basically hedging against two things. First of all, is low electricity prices, which keep getting lower in the Netherlands due to a higher share of renewable energy, and they are also lowering the taxes on electricity. And the second is against high gas prices, because this combined heat and power unit runs on gas. And if the gas prices are higher than the electricity prices, that way you make a loss on your heating, while the purpose is to make a profit. So adding Bitcoin mining also allows someone to import cheap electricity, or to shield against high gas prices in and use this electrical heating as the sole heating source for your plants. So right now we use it in combination with the two, CHP and Bitcoin mining. But in the future, we can also just use Bitcoin mining in order to heat these greenhouses. Also, what's important to know is that electrical heating is much, much, much more expensive than gas heating. It's about 3 times as high per megawatt hour. So, if you look at it from a Bitcoin mining perspective, in this way, you can offset your Bitcoin mining costs through the sales of heat to a greenhouse, but you also offset your heating costs by mining Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because, as we get more competitive kind of in the mining space in general, as difficulty has gone up, computational hardware required has, gone way up. Places like Europe, it is really not, lucrative to mine Bitcoin, especially in the past year because of electricity prices rising so much. So you almost have to become pretty creative in the use case. And this seems like such a perfect example. So you mentioned that, you're using some of the excess heat. Bitcoin miners generate like a very large amount of heat, obviously. So how much of that heat, is, that's going towards the horticulture, towards the greenhouse? How much is that kind of being offset in terms of the cooling required for what you guys need? I guess if that makes sense, this question. How much is being utilized by the greenhouse to mitigate, is it like 30%, 40% less cooling required, or?
We use all the heat from our Bitcoin miners. So we use a novel technique. It's called immersion cooling. And by doing this, you don't use air cooling. You don't use fans. So it also doesn't make noise. But what you do with immersion cooling, you just drop the naked hash boards in a um, non electric fluid. It doesn't short circuit when you drop it in, and by dropping it in fluid, your heat transfer is much higher. You can kind of compare it as if you were jumping in a pool on a hot day. You instantly cool off, and then this hot fluid in which the hashboards lie, they are running through pipes and then through a heat exchanger, which is basically two pipes next to each other. In the one is the hot immersion fluid, in the other one is water. Through the heat exchanger, the heat is exchanged to both fluids. So on the one hand, cool water comes in, goes to the heat exchanger, hot water goes out and into the greenhouse. And for the immersion fluid in which the hashboards lie of the miners, or hot fluid comes in and cool fluid goes back to the miners, and then the cycle is repeated.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think that's incredible. I think this immersion cooling is becoming a lot more popular, even with, big mining operations like Riot, for example, in the US. It seems to be much more efficient, especially if you have somewhat of a decent scale. I'd imagine the startup cost is a little bit higher, but that's that's the sort of innovation Bitcoin brings to the table. I think it's going to continue to happen, and I talk a lot about this as well. So my next question is, kind of how did you think about this idea? Like, when did this come to fruition? What were some of the biggest hurdles to get started, and what has been the reception in the Netherlands around doing sort of this kind of very innovative idea, including Bitcoin mining as, an input as part of this kind of more cohesive system?
I think the biggest obstacle is for sure getting the understanding of the growers, of the greenhouse exploiters, because you mentioned Bitcoin and they are like, that's going to zero. So it's really hard to convince these growers of buying our product when it involves Bitcoin, and especially the last year when it has been crashing down. They are like, well, will it go up again? Well, we think so, obviously, but you got to convince them. They are the ones investing, and yeah, it definitely is higher in expenses in the capital costs with the immersion cooling. But and also another advantage of immersion cooling is, by the way, that you can overclock very easily and reliably, which is also an asset when it comes to heating, because if you overclock, you also generate more heat.
Are you interested in 100% grass-fed, grass-finished bison meat? I'm excited to be a partner with Falls Family Ranches. Based in Wyoming, Falls Family Ranches is raising high-quality bison meat the way nature intended. As a native large ruminant of North America, bison is one of the most nutrient-dense foods you can consume. If you're interested in trying out their bison boxes, use code Tristan, Tristan 10 for 10% off your first order.
Interesting. I mean, all this stuff is so fascinating to me. I think, like you said, the most difficult part about discussing any of this stuff, even if we get into diet, which I think we'll kind of dive into a little bit about some of your story there, but the most difficult part for any sort of paradigm shift is getting the sort of the average population or the farmers or whoever you're talking to understand the potential benefit versus the older system. So I'm actually curious, because this is like a conversation we've had on the podcast a couple times, whether it's around food or whatever. How do we have these conversations more? Obviously, these podcasts help to get information out there, but how do we get that conversation going with people that maybe don't understand these concepts as well as I do? And I'm definitely not on the high end of the spectrum of understanding the full length of these things, but I understand the importance of having the discussions and the implications that they could have positively on pretty much everything we're trying to achieve. So it's like, how do we open the conversation and sort of like begin that dialogue and sort of help people evolve with these new ideas? You know what I mean? Because I'm sure that's been a struggle for you guys.
Yeah. Maybe what's like your pitch?
Yeah.
How do you talk to these, growers and try and bring them on board? Because I think we've seen a similar thing here in the U.S. with like ranchers and trying to get them on board with accepting Bitcoin, for example.
Basically, what we've done up till now is focus on the money. We say, we go in there, we say, we have this product, it will make you a lot of money. Over the past 4 years, it has performed like X, and it's the payback period is 2 years, and that's how we convinced our first 3 projects. But just recently, we started our marketing strategy, and we're trying to be actual thought leaders in the sphere. So doing a lot of social media marketing, posting our thoughts on LinkedIn, which is our main platform for business. And that's basically how we're trying to influence the public and shift the narrative and convince people this is a good idea. Because even our good friend Satoshi said in 2010, the energy is not wasted if you use it to heat your house. And if a grower should decide to go to lose the gas heating and go for sustainable electrical heating, then in my mind, the Bitcoin mining is superior over exploiting an e-boiler, just because of the extra revenue you get from the mining. You can even make profit of the heating. So that's how good it is. Whilst an e-boiler just destroys the electricity and exchanges it for heat. With Bitcoin mining, you effectively use your electricity twice. Once for Bitcoin mining and second for heating.
Yeah, I think when you kind of lay it out like that, and I mean, Bitcoin is wild because it's like, if you look at the track record, it's obviously the best performing asset class by like a country mile in the past. And if you just take it over a 3 to 4 year time period, it's always in the green. But nevertheless, there's a lot of, negative attention that kind of sways people the other direction, which is quite fascinating. So as something you mentioned earlier that is really interesting and has been in the news a lot here recently in the United States is, how Bitcoin mining interacts with the grid. Is it positive? Is it negative? This large energy consumption footprint. So you mentioned that the Netherlands, it's a very high percentage of renewables, solar and wind. And inherently that creates a lot of instability because solar, the sun only shines for a certain period of time. The wind only blows for a certain period of time, right? So it inherently creates instability to the grid. So is this something that's like, an increasingly larger problem in the Netherlands? And do you see Bitcoin mining as kind of a solution to that? And has there been firms and other groups like, Texas, for example, here in the US, and a lot of these mining companies are doing, initial studies and research with the Energy Reliability Council of Texas. Is there any momentum like this going on in the Netherlands? Do you see this being a possibility, or is it more so even heavier on the renewable train, kind of the ESG train over there?
Okay, yeah, this is where the story gets even better when it comes to load balancing. First of all, we have good grid connections to Germany, France, the UK, and I think even Norway. So if we have an abundance of electricity, we can export it. But this usually means that we lose money on the electricity. However, by implementing these Bitcoin miners on a greenhouse with a combined heat and power unit, you basically close the energy loop on the greenhouse, because the CHP is providing power solely for the Bitcoin miners, and the heat of the CHP and the Bitcoin miners goes into the greenhouse. Whilst before, the CHP was delivering heat to the greenhouse and was forced to sell its electricity to the grid, which potentially creates instability. By integrating these two, and you're closed off from the grid, you can stand by for a load balancing service for upward balancing, and upward balancing means delivering electricity to the grid, and for downward balancing, which means taking electricity from the grid. So when a signal comes in that Tenet, our transmission system operator, says we need downward balancing services, we shut down our CHP, and the grid provides all the electricity for the Bitcoin miners at a very cheap price. You even get paid to do this, and then you can just overclock. So you use 2 times as much electricity per miner. And in the other case, if it's not sunny or windy, Tenet can send a signal to a CHP, and then we turn off the Bitcoin miners. We fully load up the CHP, and then the electricity gets provided to the grid. And we have about 2,500 megawatts of power, electrical power from all the CHPs in our horticulture sector. So, whilst nationally Bitcoin mining hasn't gained that much traction in the load balancing here in the Netherlands, we are definitely providing our load balancing services with our Bitcoin miners.
Yeah, that's like so fantastic, right? Like that's what it's all about. And I think even this application to me is even more so flexible than say like, a large Bitcoin miner. So I know something I'm trying to get more, I guess, just agnostic about is exactly how often, these large flexible loads, aka Bitcoin miners, are going online, offline, or scaling down and scaling up. Because obviously, if you're just a business solely Bitcoin mining, you're not going to want to go on and off or down and up. You want to stay online as much as possible, right? Because any downtime is lost money. But sometimes the incentives of the electricity prices are so high that it's actually not profitable to mine anymore. But in your case, you actually have like this secondary option with the CHP to be scaling up or down on a moment's notice, and it seems to be even more flexible in this regard, which is fantastic. And you're again utilizing all of this heat coming from the miners. And yeah, you mentioned kind of the interesting point, and what's different as well from the US is, the Europe grid is very interconnected. But you're wanting to keep that electricity more local, because you're saying, transmitting electricity to England, UK, or Norway, or wherever, Germany, you're losing a lot of that in transmission losses, power losses, right? So it's actually very inefficient to send electricity like these very long distances. And this is something as well that Bitcoin mining kind of helps fix and improve, is keeping it local. So we talk a lot about, buying food local and all these types of things. Keeping your electricity and energy local is also a very important aspect of, just consuming electricity. So something that I'm curious about, you mentioned 2,500 megawatts of horticulture. Is that across the whole country? And, how big, tapping a little bit into the food system side of thing, how big is like the greenhouse growing of food in the Netherlands? Is it like it seems like a very large percentage of how people grow produce, for example, because here in the US, I don't even know, but it's got to be like less than 1% probably.
Yeah, I've never
small.
heard of it being a thing here at all.
Yeah, no worries. I'm kind of just, tapping into, how popular is horticulture and the growing of food in greenhouses in the Netherlands. It seems like it's a pretty high percentage, or a decent chunk of how farmers grow food. Is that correct?
I'm not
Is it
sure
gaining
about.
popularity? I'm just curious in general, because it seems like in the US, I've never really heard of many people doing it. Small examples here and there. But yeah. I've read before about how this is, much more popular in Europe.
Yeah. Well, it's. I'm not sure what the relative numbers are, but it is very popular, and we're also, not to boast or anything, but we are the best greenhouse exploiters in the world. And greenhouses here are popular because we don't have a lot of land. Netherlands is by far the most populated country of Europe, and we are trying to use our land very sparingly. So yeah, all our tomatoes are grown in greenhouses. Most of all the bell peppers as well. Only thing we use for regular agriculture are things like the potatoes, the onions, and other crops which are resistant to the cold. That's really important. We are the most densely populated country in the world, and we use our land very sparingly. Only we are a large exporter of food, and we only employ around 2% of our population in agriculture. In other countries, this is much larger, and that is also the main difference with the US. In the US, you have a lot of spare land, so you can just get the sun for free, get the heat for free. You have all the land you want. But in the Netherlands, it's very scarce, so we're also always looking for newer innovations in our food sector in order to improve the productivity per acre.
Yeah, no, it's totally part of it. And all I was going to say was, like, I think we can really take a lot of lessons from like what you guys are doing over there in sort of utilization of smaller space and sort of maximizing, not necessarily like maximizing output, obviously, but also sort of that focus on hyper localization and focusing on that in the energy grid too. Cause I feel like we do so many things, and this kind of goes maybe broadly like around the world, but specifically in the US, I feel like especially in our agricultural sector, we do so many things inefficiently. Like we were talking about this in several podcasts, but we just have things built on systems that are not only outdated, but are just not energy efficient. And so it's really interesting hearing about sort of the marriage between Bitcoin and horticultural, because it sounds like not only is it sort of a net positive for like growing food and stuff like that, but as far as an energy benefit, you're sort of balancing those two acts together. And I think that's just extremely smart and something that I think a lot of people should be like taking a harder look at, because there are just so many things that, whether it's for exploitation of profit or whatever, just seems to be so inefficient. And then other things like Bitcoin are being thrown under the bus as like the bad guy somehow for energy or whatever it is. And nobody's just logically looking at it from a 30,000 foot view, because it seems to be a lot of net positives, in my opinion.
I see the net positives as well. And probably when you do see greenhouse operators in North America, a Dutchie is probably involved in the management of it.
That's funny. Yeah, no, that's kind of exactly what I was teeing you up for, because it's so fascinating how each food system kind of has to be, adaptive to what you have available in that country. So my question is, is horticulture, greenhouses, is this the future for growing, all produce? Is there any downsides to doing this? And what can be implemented, to make it maybe more similar or be more nutrient dense, for example, compared to growing in the soil? Because here in the US, a big problem with produce, and probably everywhere in the world, we've exploited a lot of the soil that we use to grow crops. So a lot of the produce is actually less nutrient dense than say 50, 100 years ago. And this is a big issue because we've only gone for yield and really destroy the quality of our soil through industrial farming practices. So is this something that can be, implemented or reversed, say, for example, or, done in horticulture to where we can get back to a more nutrient dense raising of produce and crops?
I think that there lies a bright future ahead for greenhouses, mainly because of the things I already said, that the land is very scarce. The main disadvantage is obviously that it's very energy intensive. So during our energy crisis, a lot of greenhouse exploiters didn't even start with growing because um, they had bought gas and electricity at a low price in the past for the future. And they just sold their gas positions and electricity positions to the market because it was more profitable than growing tomatoes. Um, Furthermore, we in the Netherlands we have the one of the most fertile soils, at least in Europe. We lay next to the sea, and we even like poured a lot of ground or sand into the sea, and we created our own land. It's called Flevoland, which is where I'm from, and that's a large agricultural hub for just regular crop growing on land, and we do it very efficiently with mechanization, fertilizers, but we don't overdo it with the fertilizers because we have a lot of strict regulations regarding that. And yeah, I see a future for greenhouses. Vertical farming is also more upcoming in the Netherlands, but that is even more energy intensive. So yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah, I mean, and there's also like, it's speaking of like energy output and all this stuff, there's this huge discussion on like slashing emissions over in I mean, everywhere really, but in the Netherlands, especially with nitrogen, they're trying to slash half of emissions by 2030 and stuff like that. I kind of love your opinion on the nitrogen crisis and sort of what things are applicable with what you are doing to sort of maybe not necessarily aid in that, but just sort of your position on it, because I feel like there's a lot of different angles to tackle it.
Yeah. So the nitrogen crisis is mostly aimed at our livestock production, which is fairly large. And what is happening is back in the early 2000s, our municipalities were given the order to appoint protected nature areas, which are typical Dutch. And because these municipalities thought they would receive subsidy in the Netherlands, basically every piece of nature was regarded as this Nature 2000 protected area. Fast forward to now, we have this nitrogen crisis. That's a nice framing for making it more urgent than it is because, when I walk outside, I have no problems with the nitrogen in the air, but they call it the nitrogen crisis for some political framing. What happened is the politicians said, well, we need to go back to, or we need to restore the nature in the Netherlands. And well, the funny thing about this is that we have no nature in the Netherlands. All of it is man-made. So it's a political choice to to call this, or to have a problem with this nitrogen crisis. And what happened for most of these nature areas, they looked at pictures or drawings from the 1700s and from the 1700s until the 1900s, and they concluded, well, there were a lot of dunes and a lot of like meadow, and now we have trees. So we actually have more biodiversity in our nature than we had back then. But that is the problem. We need to go back to the classical nature of the 1700s, which are like sand, areas of sand and no vegetation at all. And the leakage of nitrogen is obviously beneficial for plants because they like nitrogen. And as a consequence, to reduce the nitrogen emissions, which come from the cows, who excrete the nitrogen, and that is why they are trying to expropriate our farmers. I'm not sure what the actual reason is, but I have a hard time believing it is purely meant for nature.
Yeah, and the public outcry has been, pretty well documented, well, covered, or at least on our end in our little bubble over here. It seems like there's been a substantial pushback on these measures. I think, right, the Farmers Party, or I don't know exactly what it's called, has done very well in the recent elections. So is this, do you say as well that the majority, mindset is kind of against a lot of these measures? And how do you think this will kind of play out in the next few years?
Ooh, I'm not sure about how it will play out, but what is good to mention is that we Dutch, we are not like the French. We don't like to protest. So when it does happen, it's actually really serious. It doesn't happen just like that. It's we can take a lot of shit from politics, but when you trying to expropriate our farmers of the best agricultural country of the world, then we take a problem. And so these farmers went to our political heart on their big machines, and the police were like, "Oh, well, we can't stop this. They are way too powerful." And that's when the media started hitting them. And now because the nitrogen crisis does not only involve the farmers, but it's also impacting our ability to build houses, because these politicians say, well, we are at the nitrogen limit. Building a house, and we have a housing shortage. Building a house emits nitrogen. We first need to buy out the farmer, and then we can build an apartment. So these farmers are also getting blamed for our housing shortage, which is obviously false, because it's a political decision. Because if you go over the border to Germany, their nitrogen limits are 1,000 times as high. There was even this researcher who said, who commented on the nitrogen limit, and he said, well, if you just let one dog take a dump on a hectare of land, you already exceed the nitrogen limit. So it's that strict. And regarding our elections, this was a historic win for any political party. 2 years ago, they came as a new party into our. I think it's this. No, it's not the Senate, but anyway, the people who make the laws and control or check the government, and they got one seat out of 150, and then 2 years later, the Senate is chosen, which approves bills, and they were and this and the Senate is divided into our provinces. So Flevoland gets X amount of seats, and uh, Overijssel gets X amount of seats, and they were the largest in every province there is, all 12 provinces. And no other political party has ever managed to do that. So it's an historic win.
Yeah, it's been so interesting to follow this, and I see so many parallels with also what we've experienced here. Just a comment is with COVID, right? It's like, and I want to dive into kind of how your mindset has evolved around going against centralized corporations and entities like this, because it's basically like our government, they inch forward, right, for more control year on year and over decades. This turns into quite a big step, right? But you don't really notice it. Society is a bit lackadaisical and realizing what's happening as they give up their freedoms. But what I've seen here with both COVID and the lockdowns, the vaccine mandates, and the passports, that was a large step that was too uncomfortable for so many people, and that resulted in a lot of pushback, which is good, and it woke a lot of people up. So it seems like this kind of whole situation here with the nitrogen crisis in the Netherlands is also the same thing, because you're saying we're not like the French, we don't like to protest, which is hilarious, and it's serious. It's like, what, at what point does a society in whatever country it is reach that tipping point where they're saying no, like we're not dealing with this is ridiculous, and then they push back. And I think this is an important piece to know, because I think this is going to keep unfolding around the world, especially in the Western world, to where the society has more power than people think, but it has to reach that threshold to where they're saying, fuck no, this is absolutely ridiculous. We are not dealing with this sort of government intervention in our society, in the way we run our daily lives, especially in something that's so important as growing food and the raising of livestock and things like. And you're comparing it to other countries, the levels of nitrogen, it's just outrageous, and it makes no sense. So it's quite clear it's a motive. The motive is purely for control and just more centralized policies. So it's really fascinating. I wanted to highlight that because I think that's kind of a theme here that we see, and the waking up of society is really important as we try and get back to empowering individuals.
And I just wanted to add to that too, because I think there's this misconception in sort of the general pop, especially here, but over there where people are trying to shut down farmers, and like same things happening here, we're trying to shut down farmers. And we've interviewed, we're going to be interviewing more regenerative farmer Mitch in particular, who we talked about, like, how do we use the land for the highest efficiency? How do we use the land to replenish the soil, and all these ecosystems interacting together? And there's just such a separation now from people and nature that we just don't understand how all these things are interconnected. And really, we shouldn't be listening to, and I think more people, especially after 2020, are much more awakened to this idea and questioning. And I think that's sort of been building over the last, since even 2000, like that I've seen it grow in my like local communities of questioning political rhetoric and stuff like that. But does it really make common sense to listen to a politician who's never worked on the land or any of these things talk about what's good and what's bad with using the land for the environment? Or should we be listening to the farmer who's on the land using it every single day and listening to their views on what needs to be done to have a more vibrant use of that land? And to me, the answer is obvious. And I think if you really think about it on a very common sense level, that's the obvious answer. But yeah, it's just, I think it's really good as far as the amount of information that is now out there and people questioning things. I think that's huge. And I think that'll only continue as well.
Yeah. What you said about the politicians making these decisions, it makes me think of a quote of Eisenhower, who said, "Farming looks damn easy when your plow is a pen and you're 1,000 miles away from the cornfield." And that's also what's happening here, because what we saw in COVID, but also this nitrogen crisis, our politicians um, just blindly follow scientific models, which were made by people they also hire. And so we've landed in this technocratic form of ruling, where the politicians say, well, we follow the science, and so we don't have any, what should I say, we don't take accountability for our decision because we're just doing what the science says. So we have this task force, the nitrogen task force, who find the top 10 polluters, and we have to buy them out. And yeah, that's a nice way of removing accountability from politics and laying it with someone else. And that's what I see happening here in the Netherlands.
Yeah, I think it's the perfect way to think about it. But to me, it's, how do you continue that fight, and how do you, get more people realizing that they have more power than they actually, know they do. So I think you have a society that's pretty ripe for the orange pilling. I would say, something we've seen here, we're trying to do here is, these ranchers, the folks who are actually putting in the hard work that make, our society possible to run, and feeding the country, feeding the world. These people are typically very skeptical of government, but here in the U.S., they're so reliant on them. So many farmers and ranchers, they're just programmed by what the USDA does, whether it's because they're just growing monocrop products, and they're getting, insurance, crop insurance and checks to guarantee their income, and they don't want to change because the average age is so high. But in general, a lot of these ranchers are realizing that in order to stay afloat, they have to innovate to some degree, and, going direct to consumer, being more regenerative by nature, all these types of things. And then their mindset, to me, is really aligned with, what Bitcoin can provide. And that's why we're here trying to, grow this circular economy and exchanging value for value. So it'd be fascinating to see, if that's possible over there, because like I said, clearly you have a lot of folks that are, realizing that less government is more. And, if they have this education that Bitcoin can empower that even further at the individual level, and then you have something that's kind of, outside of the whole European financial system, which is a conversation in and of its own. And I think we're seeing the slow collapse of a lot of these, more centralized unions, especially as the US dollar and the whole Western financial system is kind of on its last limb here, perhaps. But yeah, that's something we're trying to grow. And I'm curious if you agree with that. I'm assuming you do. And it's like, can we start getting horticulture growers and getting this Bitcoin circular economy going?
I think we have a nice fruitful soil for orange pilling here in the Netherlands, but in the European Union, we always have this, with regard to the euro, we have this north versus south debate, because the south wants high inflation in order to dilute their debt, and that way they can also stay competitive on the world markets. But in Northern Europe, we like low inflation with high interest, because we are very productive with our labor hours. Just like Brexit, we are also talking about Nexit, and that we see the euro as a hindrance, in our national policy, and how we can, contain our personal wealth. And yeah, Bitcoin is not catching up here, because we have one of the best banking systems in the world. So, as Alex Gladstein would say, we suffer from financial privilege. And I also think the initial marketing of Bitcoin has been wrong, because it has been marketed as money, and people here just say, well, Bitcoin is useless because you can't buy anything with it. It's money, right? Why can't I buy anything with it? And so we need to reframe that Bitcoin isn't money, but it's good technology. It's an asset. I like the way I like to describe it. It's digital gold. It's gold without weight. You can send it across the ocean for a penny, and you can store it in your head. And that's basically the great advantage of Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think the greatest advantage is that it's more than one thing, right? So it's like depending on, in
Mm,
Venezuela, it's
yeah.
money. In Argentina and Nigeria, it's money. In the
Hmm.
United States, in the Netherlands, in, Switzerland, it's not money, really. Not right now. And I don't think you can, yeah, like you're saying, you shouldn't lead with that. But that's so fascinating. I think about it all the time because you're talking about the North versus South in Europe. And yeah, to me, it makes no sense to have just the cultures, right? You look at a Spain, Italy, Greece, like
Hmm.
they obviously they don't work as hard. They have much more, siestas and things just ingrained into their society, which is okay because, that's just how their culture is. And they
Hmm.
have a lot of great products and things like that. And tourism, it's, very heavy in tourism, right? So it's just different, right? And you can't just lump everything together with highly productive, more efficient societies like Germany, Netherlands, and that's kind of why I see this just as well not working out. So I'm really curious to see how it unfolds. But at the end of the day, it just you're forcing different cultures and different economies to try and mesh together, and it
Hmm.
just doesn't work out. But I really like how you've highlighted that in terms of what Bitcoin is, and to me that was just like an epiphany to the fact that that's another reason Bitcoin is so valuable is because it's so dynamic.
Yeah.
It can mesh, and it can be of value for different reasons to different people in different places.
That's very true. And so in these countries where they lack the financial privilege that we have, it is emerging as money. And that's also why the developing countries are the most popular Bitcoin countries in the world right now. Also, this cultural thing, because our European Union probably looks a lot at the United States and is thinking, well, if it works there, it can work here. But you probably have more sympathy for someone from Washington State, Florida, or California, or whatever, than I have for a Greek or a Spaniard or a Slovenian or whatever, because we we don't want to pay for the Greeks, and the Greeks don't want to pay for us, and that misaligns in the policy.
Yeah, there is like some of that, like the difference, the cultural difference there. There's a little bit of that here, but I mean, we all know kind of the story of America or whatever. But
Hmm.
like we started as like the union broke. There's definitely like state differences that I think are pretty big, and you can kind of see the divides growing and sort of especially with like these sort of ideas about more government control versus less government control. I go to California like once a month for work, and I see it definitely a completely different like cultural ideology on how they think the world should work compared to here in Utah. And there's definitely, but it is a larger divide over there where you have many more years of different cultural practices and stuff like that expand. And I hear that talk all the time when I visit family in the UK. They'll travel to Greece and they hear all this stuff, and it's definitely a lot of different. And even with the UK and the EU, like they never adopted the euro and stuff like that. So like there's sort of like this independence as well. So on some levels, I think because there's a global nature with the way the economies are now, there's always going to be some like connectivity, but there's always going to be, I think, separation. I feel like there's like this idealistic world that everyone that's higher up in policy wants to see, where
Hmm.
everyone's like extra connected. But I just don't think it's possible, and especially like the way they're trying to push people now even heavier after 2020. It's just like it's actually, I think, making it more difficult for them, which in my opinion is good, to achieve that goal. You know what I mean?
I see what you're saying. Yes.
Yeah, and I'm curious as well as to kind of wrap up, something we talked about is that you've also gone, you've changed, your diet quite a bit. So
Hmm.
obviously something I'm Ryan and I, talk about a lot is health, nutrition, and I write about is like the intersection between beef and Bitcoin, and in general, it's a fascinating overlap, right? There's a lot of carnivores now in the Bitcoin space. I think it's for the same mindset and principle of taking ownership of your life. Is that kind of how you saw it, and how did you go down this rabbit hole, and what exactly have you adjusted in this facet of your life?
Yeah, so people taking ownership of their life, especially Bitcoiners, is because now they have a long time horizon. They are not in the despair anymore of my dollar is losing value every year and houses keep getting more expensive and my wages stay flat because they're sticky. So that's really fascinating to see in the Bitcoin space that people are also very much focused on health because of this long time horizon. They're like, okay, well, my Bitcoin is going to last forever. It's going to go up forever. So I should take care of myself so I can, pick the fruits of my Bitcoin journey. And for me personally, with my diet, we have to go back to what you guys would call high school. I was 18 and I had to do like my last final project, and everyone has to do this. And my last final project, I didn't know what to do. So during my orientation, I watched Cowspiracy, and I basically concluded, well, I think veganism is the way. It's the most ethical way to eat, and it's probably healthier than what we do now because cholesterol is bad for you, and if you eat meat, you're probably gonna die of a heart attack. And I stick to it for 1 to 2 years, a vegan. But then I became a student, and I remember so clearly. Domino's had like these days where you can get a pizza for €3, and so well, I got me some pizza because I like pizza, and that was basically the first downfall of my vegan journey. Then I went to vegetarian, and that was also a transition. And then I basically went to a standard Dutch diet, not thinking about the macros, but just eating what I like. And I think, well, broccoli is healthy, so I'll eat some broccoli sometimes and have a hamburger with it. And then when I was training for my first boxing match, I really got into fasting, and the fasting really made me feel good because when I'm hungry, I'm also more eager to do things. Like this primal activation of, well, you're hungry, you better go and do something about it. And it wasn't obviously that the main goal then was to get some food, but just be productive. And I lost a lot of weight. I went from, I think, 77 to 70 kilograms. So that is about 16 pounds or something of weight loss. And yeah, I was basically in the best shape of my life. And I continued this for a long time, doing 1 day fasts, 2 day fasts, even 3 day fasts. And even one time I did a 1 week fast, only drinking salt and coffee, black coffee. And what amazing was is that I was able, during the 7 day fast, I was able to keep working. And it wasn't like a light job. I worked at a bar, so it was a lot of standing and partying. And yeah, that was really special because fasting comes with a lot of benefits. And the main benefits for me was that it increases human growth hormone for a short time. Obviously, you get very fast into a state of ketosis, which makes you burn fat. And because your body is basically starving, it tries to recycle all the dead cells or useless cells, and basically eats this, which is a process called autophagy. So you're also making your body way more efficient with its energy if you start practicing fasting. Then I had my boxing match. I went back to the standard Dutch diet, and then I got into Bitcoin. And I had this crazy friend who lived with me. And on one day he was like, "You gotta eat raw liver, man. It's nature's vitamin pill." And at first I was like, "You're talking crazy." And he showed me this guy, and like, "Oh, he's eating it, and look how good he is." And he has this videos of the epitome of malnourishment where he shows malnourished vegans. And well, I got down that rabbit hole, and the carnivore diet convinced me for two reasons. The first one is um, that when you look at a forest or the plants, if and the edible plants, if you look at all the plants, only 5%, which is a large estimate, but it's probably closer to 1% of all the plants is edible. The rest is non-digestible or poisonous. So what makes me think rationally that this 1 to 5% of plants that I find in the supermarket are healthy for me? And then in my master's of agriculture, I learned about bottom-up pesticides, which basically mean that the plants they put poison, a little bit of poison in their leaves in order to repel the insects from eating it. And the second thing was the first Europeans came to Europe around 12,000 years ago, but the agricultural revolution was 10,000 years ago. So in this 2,000 years, what would they eat in the winter when all the plants are dead? It's only meat. So that last reason basically convinced me like you can live on only meat. Is it optimal? I don't know. And I'm not a pure carnivore. I'm more like animal-based diet because when talking about these bottom-up pesticides again, there are clearly parts of plants that are meant to be eaten. And these are the fruits, which is why apples are sweet, bananas are sweet, grapes are sweet, because the tactic of these fruits is that we eat them or an animal eats them, and then the seed passes through the body, and when you excrete it, you poop it out, the seed lies in a pile of manure, which is a good soil for eventually growing. And that's basically my dietary path.
Yeah, I mean, me and Tristan have pretty similar stories as far as like discovering animal-based diets and stuff like that. And actually, it's really interesting because you mentioned sort of like you had those ethical reasons and health reasons for going vegan. I think that's a pretty common story. I have a really close friend that actually had an eating disorder and then tried to recover his eating disorder with veganism, and it completely flubbed. Like he had about a good 2 years, and then he started having issues with his collagen and like joint health and all these things because you need all these bioavailable amino acids that just aren't as readily available in plants. And like you mentioned, like, I mean, there's obviously like plant toxins, there's all the herbicides and the pesticides that we put on the plants. And there's a lot of these issues, not to throw all plants under the bus per se, but there's definitely this sort of narrative that goes around that I think can make sense in the way that our culture is now, so removed from nature and our past and being connected with the earth. And I think what's amazing is that everyone I've met, including you, who's gone through this evolution of thought and sort of landed on that animal-based diet, talks about Bitcoin and all this stuff, is sort of this regaining of our innate intelligence. Like our bodies know what it needs. Mm-hmm. And if we just listen to it, we'll know what to eat. And that includes animal foods 100% of the time. And so it's really just, it goes back to common sense. And like at the end of the day, part of the message we're trying to achieve with this show is just like, you need to listen to your own innate intelligence. It's there. It's telling you what direction to take, is giving you the clues, but we're so tuned out from all the noise. and we're so stressed out. We live these busy lives that don't make any sense. And a lot of us aren't even necessarily being productive. Like you said, we had a lot of discussion about productivity and the Bitcoin usage and the horticulture and stuff like that. Is we're not productive. We work more than ever, especially here in the US. And it's all backwards. And so I think a lot of the stuff we talked about today is sort of how are we resetting these things in our mind and in our environment around us. And sort of the last question I'd like to ask you too is, someone out there, we always ask is how can somebody, and how have you done this as well, but what are some steps that people can take to sort of begin to decentralize themselves and sort of begin to take that orange pill and open themselves up to these new broader horizons that at the end of the day aren't, I mean, there's complexities within them, but a lot of it goes back to pure logic, in my opinion, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I think you know a lot. I gotta catch that.
Thank you. I think the first, and it's the biggest step, is taking complete accountability for everything that happens in your life. I think that because people who are caught up in politics, for example, they think, well, if Joe Biden gets into office this time, he will make everyone's life better. But you have to do it yourself. If we talk about health, wealth, and relationships, basically the three pillars of happiness or building your life, you're responsible for your own health. You are in charge of everything that goes into your mouth. You are in charge of your own exercise. You don't need a gym membership to be fit. You can just go outside and go for a run, do some push-ups, find a tree, do some pull-ups. You can get into amazing and healthy shape. For your wealth, I think most people are stuck on trying to invest in real estate and stocks. My main problem is that these can be very easily expropriated or diluted. I think getting onto the Bitcoin train is probably the best thing you can do for your wealth. It cannot be censored, cannot be taken away from you, and it's very liquid and mobile. So if the Netherlands has a crackdown on Bitcoin and saying it's banned, okay, I'll just take it and go over the border. And if you look at the last pillar, relationships, you are the one who is in control. If you want to make more, you got to shake more. So shake as many hands as possible. And so my main tip is extreme ownership of your own life, extreme accountability. Everything that happens to you, even if it looks like bad luck, it is your own fault. I think that's the main thing.
I couldn't have said it better than myself. I think that's a huge lesson that I've had to learn. I think everyone that gets into this journey at all learns that. But thanks for being here, Maikel. We'll have to continue the conversation again. Tell people where they can find you and your work, any of that stuff.
Yeah, sure. I'm active on Twitter at Maikel the Lion. You can add me on LinkedIn if you want to talk business about Bitcoin mining in horticulture. It is Maikel de Leeuw, which is the lion in Dutch. And yeah, those are my socials.
Love it. I appreciate it. Thanks for everyone joining, and we'll see you in the next one.
Yes, thank you very much.